There are some people in life who can handle awkward situations with pure genius, and my grandpa was one of those people. I'll never forget the family who lived a few houses down, who somehow decided that our house was the place to be every single night for dinner. At first, we tried to be polite. Grandma, being the sweet and welcoming person she was, would set out a few extra plates, thinking it was just a temporary thing. The first night felt almost charming, a little neighborhood warmth, a sense of community. We laughed and joked about how unexpected their visits were, and I admit, it was kind of nice to have company. But soon, the charm wore off. The visits became a routine, and not the kind of routine you enjoy. Every single evening, right when the smell of dinner was filling our house, there would be a knock at the door, and there they were. The husband would offer some vague apology, the wife would look tired, and then inevitably they'd explain that they didn't feel like cooking and didn't want to trouble themselves with their own meal. At first, we felt sorry for them. Everyone deserves a break now and then, right? So, we welcomed them in, set a plate or two extra, and tried to act like nothing was unusual. But then reality set in. Night after night, they kept coming. And not only did they come, they took over. They never brought anything, never offered to help with dishes, and always took the biggest portions as if they had earned them. It was almost comical in how shameless it was, but by the third night, frustration was bubbling under the surface. Grandma tried to hint politely, "Maybe you could come over another time?" But hints flew right over their heads. They were blissfully unaware, or perhaps purposefully oblivious. Grandpa, on the other hand, was done playing nice. He wasn't confrontational in a typical way. His approach was subtle, creative, and, honestly, hilarious. He spent an entire week observing the family's behavior, watching as they lounged at our table, practically hoarding the food while leaving Grandma to do all the work. He'd shake his head, mutter under his breath, and then retreat to his chair, thinking, enough is enough. Then came the night that would go down in family legend. We had finished eating, and as usual, they lingered a bit too long, chatting about trivial things while Grandma started washing the dishes. Grandpa, however, had a plan. Calmly, deliberately, he pushed back his chair, got up, and walked over to the table. Without a word, he picked up the plates filled with the leftover food and set them on the floor. Our dogs, who had been lounging nearby, perfectly aware of the situation, immediately sprang into action. Chaos ensued in the most wonderful way, tails wagging, paws scrambling, and slobbery tongues everywhere. They licked every single plate clean, leaving nothing behind. The family was frozen, shocked, speechless. You could see the gears turning in their heads, wondering if they had imagined what just happened. Grandpa calmly bent down, picked up the now covered in dog saliva plates, wiped them off with a napkin, and placed them back into the cabinet like nothing had happened. The audacity, the calmness. It was pure grandpa genius. Finally, someone from the family, perhaps the husband, mustered the courage to ask, "Do you do that every night?" without even hiding their disbelief. Grandpa, leaning back in his chair with the faintest hint of a smile, said, "Oh, absolutely. Gotta save water, you know." The look on their faces was unforgettable, utter confusion, embarrassment, and a sudden realization that they were never going to take advantage of our hospitality again. And just like that, the family never came over for dinner again. From that night on, whenever anyone in the family asked how to politely tell guests they'd overstayed, Grandpa's story became the gold standard. It wasn't mean, it wasn't rude, it was clever, creative, and unforgettable. He had mastered the art of subtle eviction, leaving the offenders completely stunned while never raising his voice or breaking a sweat. And for those of us who witnessed it, it was one of the funniest, most satisfying lessons in human behavior we'd ever seen. After that unforgettable night, our home felt lighter in some ways. The oppressive routine of nightly visits had ended, and peace returned to the kitchen, the dining room, and most importantly, to our nerves. But the story didn't just stop with a single act of canine-assisted eviction. Grandpa, being the master of subtlety and timing, made sure that the lesson sank in, not only for the family next door, but for all of us who had been quietly suffering through their daily invasions. We all still laughed about it, even weeks later. Every time we told the story, it grew slightly taller with each retelling, as stories do in families. There were debates about whether the dogs had really licked all the plates clean, or if Grandpa had somehow exaggerated it to make the story more dramatic. But those who had witnessed it knew the truth. The dogs had attacked the plates with the ferocity of lions defending their prey, and Grandpa had sat back in his chair, watching with the calm patience of someone who had been planning this outcome for weeks. Interestingly, the family never came back, but we could still see them from our window in the evenings. Sometimes, the husband would glance over at our house as if daring us to challenge them again, and sometimes the wife would shake her head in disbelief, clearly muttering something about the nerve of that old man. Grandpa, of course, would just sit in his recliner with a cup of tea, smiling knowingly, as if he hadn't just orchestrated the most subtle eviction in suburban history. It wasn't just the act itself that was genius, it was the timing. Grandpa didn't say a single angry word. There were no harsh confrontations or embarrassing accusations. He had waited, observed, and executed with impeccable precision. The beauty of it was that it left the family confused and speechless. They didn't know how to respond, because there was no real confrontation to respond to. It was comedy and justice wrapped into a single, perfectly executed act. After that, Grandpa became a sort of local legend in our family circle. Whenever someone would complain about overbearing neighbors or friends who didn't know when to leave, he would calmly lean back in his chair and offer advice like it was a sacred ritual. "Let the dogs handle it," he'd say with a wink. "They'll do what polite conversation cannot." It became a phrase we would repeat, often laughing so hard we'd nearly fall off our chairs. Grandma, meanwhile, had mixed feelings. On the one hand, she was thrilled that the family had finally stopped taking advantage of our hospitality. On the other hand, she had to endure weeks of teasing from Grandpa, who insisted on retelling the story every night at the dinner table as if it were a heroic saga. "Did you see the look on their faces?" he'd ask, eyes twinkling. "Absolutely priceless. You can't teach lessons like that with words alone. Sometimes, you have to let the universe, or the dogs, do the talking." The children in our family, myself included, learned an important lesson about boundaries from that night. Not through lectures or parental guidance, but through observation. We saw that it was possible to set limits creatively, to stand up for oneself without being aggressive, and even to inject humor into an otherwise awkward and stressful situation. It was a masterclass in tact, timing, and subtlety, and it left a lasting impression on all of us. And, of course, it became the gold standard for telling guests they had overstayed their welcome. When friends or distant relatives lingered too long after dinner, Grandpa's story was always recounted, often with slight embellishments for maximum effect. Sometimes he'd suggest politely placing plates on the floor, or more realistically, just leaving the dogs to do what they do best. The combination of humor, surprise, and passive-aggressive precision made it unforgettable. Even years later, whenever I think about that family and their relentless nightly visits, I can't help but smile. They had unknowingly taught Grandpa, and all of us, a lesson about patience, observation, and the art of clever problem-solving. It was an ordinary suburban conflict, escalated into something legendary, all thanks to his calm demeanor and strategic mind. He had taken a frustrating situation and turned it into both a lesson and a comedy show, all without raising his voice or creating lasting resentment. After that infamous night, our family's dinner routine returned to normal, but Grandpa, true to form, didn't let the lesson fade so quickly. He had a way of reminding everyone that boundaries were important, not through nagging or scolding, but through subtle, hilarious reinforcement. Even weeks later, whenever someone lingered too long at the table, he would casually glance at them, raise an eyebrow, and say in a perfectly calm voice, "Remember, the floor is always an option." Everyone knew exactly what he meant, and the chuckles that followed reinforced that the family next door had been dealt a masterclass in social boundaries. The story quickly became a point of pride within our household. Grandma, though occasionally exasperated by Grandpa's endless retellings, eventually began to embrace it. She'd add her own flair, embellishing small details to make the story sound even more outrageous. "And don't forget," she'd say, "he didn't just set the plates down. He wiped them off with a napkin afterward." I swear, it was like something out of a sitcom. Each retelling grew more dramatic, painting Grandpa as the calm but cunning hero who had tamed the unruly neighbors with nothing but his wits, and a couple of very enthusiastic dogs. But the genius of it wasn't just the act itself, it was the psychological impact. The family never returned, and we knew it wasn't just fear of our dogs. It was the realization that Grandpa could outthink them. There was no arguing, no confrontation, no lecture. Just a single, brilliant act of passive resistance that made them rethink their nightly visits entirely. It was as if he had set up an invisible barrier. Any attempt to cross it would be met not with anger, but with the kind of humor and audacity that left no room for excuses. And Grandpa didn't stop there. Over the next few months, he experimented with other, equally subtle ways of managing guests and family dynamics. If a cousin stayed too long on a Saturday morning, he would kissoo. Ally rearranged the furniture to make the living room less comfortable, all while pretending nothing was happening. If a neighbor lingered after borrowing sugar or eggs, he'd mention casually that the dogs loved to run around and sometimes knock things over, without actually threatening anyone, just planting the idea in their heads. Every tactic was a masterclass in psychology, humor, and timing. The man had turned everyday life into a game of wits, and we were all eager spectators. The children in the family, myself included, learned early that Grandpa's methods were more effective than anger or confrontation. There was a lesson in patience and observation. Before reacting, notice the patterns, understand the motivations, and then respond with precision. It wasn't about being mean. It was about protecting the household, maintaining boundaries, and doing so in a way that left everyone, including the offending party, surprised and reflective. I carried this lesson into my own life, finding ways to address problems with subtlety and humor rather than conflict whenever possible. Of course, the story also became a social legend beyond our immediate family. Relatives visiting from out of town were always regaled with the tale, and soon everyone knew the story of Grandpa, the relentless neighbors, and the dogs that saved the day. There was something universally satisfying about it, the perfect blend of wit, humor, and silent justice. And the best part? The story was entirely believable. Anyone who knew Grandpa understood that he had the patience and cunning to pull something like this off, and anyone who didn't know him still couldn't stop laughing at the absurdity of the mental image. Even years later, the story would resurface during family gatherings, often accompanied by mock demonstrations of how to handle overstaying guests. Grandpa would pick up a plate, look around with a twinkle in his eye, and ask, "Now, who wants to try this technique responsibly?" Everyone would laugh, knowing full well that the genius of the moment lay not in aggression or confrontation, but in timing, creativity, and that unshakable calm he always maintained. In the end, the story became more than just a funny anecdote. It became a lesson. It taught us how to set boundaries, how to assert oneself without hostility, and how humor could be used to diffuse tension while sending a clear message. Grandpa had mastered an art that few could replicate, and his strategy for politely, but decisively, handling overstaying guests became legendary in our family. What started as a frustrating experience had transformed into a defining moment of wit, courage, and subtle genius, and we all carried the lessons with us long after the last dog-licked plate had been put away. After the legendary dogs and plates incident, life in our house returned to a peaceful rhythm, at least for a while. Grandpa, however, never let the lesson fade. He had a knack for turning even the most ordinary situations into opportunities for subtle teaching moments. We quickly learned that in his world, humor was a tool, and timing was everything. The next time a guest overstayed, it wasn't the neighbors. It was a distant cousin who had a habit of lingering during Sunday brunch. Grandpa, ever vigilant, watched patiently from his recliner. As the cousin droned on about her new job and vacation plans, Grandpa calmly picked up the leftover toast and jam from the table, laid it carefully on a nearby chair, and placed the dog bowl right in front of it. Our golden retriever, eyes wide and tail wagging, immediately assumed the food was fair game. The cousin's face went from oblivious to horrified in a matter of seconds, as the dog happily polished off the jam-smeared toast while Grandpa sipped his tea, pretending nothing had happened. Grandma couldn't help but laugh despite herself. "He's going to get us in trouble one day," she whispered, shaking her head. But the lesson had been delivered perfectly. Overstaying guests were met with unexpected consequences, and humor made it almost impossible to argue or feel offended. We all learned quickly to appreciate Grandpa's genius in diplomacy through chaos. It wasn't just the dogs that played a role. Grandpa developed a series of subtle psychological tactics to discourage overstaying visitors. If someone lingered too long at the kitchen table, he'd suddenly begin discussing extremely boring topics in great detail, like the exact way to polish silver or the pros and cons of different lawn fertilizers. He'd speak in a calm, deliberate monotone, staring directly at the guest, as if inviting them to chime in. Most visitors, unable to endure the combination of extreme boredom and subtle pressure, would find excuses to leave. For realizing that Grandpa had orchestrated the entire interaction. The family next door, of course, remained a source of amusement and occasional inspiration for his tactics. Whenever we mentioned them, Grandpa would smile slyly and say, "Ah yes, the pioneers of overstaying. I learned a lot from them." He told the story repeatedly, embellishing the details each time. Sometimes he claimed the dogs had done somersaults while licking the plates clean. Other times, he said the family's expressions were so priceless that even the mailman stopped by to witness it. Each retelling became more elaborate, cementing his status as a master of creative problem-solving. We, the grandchildren, watched closely and learned more than just how to handle overstaying guests. We absorbed lessons about patience, observation, and strategic thinking. Grandpa's methods demonstrated that one didn't need confrontation or anger to make a point. Careful planning, humor, and a touch of absurdity could achieve far better results. It was an education in social dynamics disguised as comedy, and it stuck with us. Even in casual conversations around the house, Grandpa's tactics became reference points. If someone mentioned a friend who couldn't take a hint or a neighbor who dropped by too often, someone would inevitably say, "Should we let the dogs handle it?" And everyone would laugh. It became a shorthand in our family for handling difficult social situations with wit and patience rather than tension. Grandpa's genius wasn't only about dealing with overstaying guests. He had a broader philosophy of life that made him a quietly formidable presence. He understood people's tendencies, anticipated reactions, and often used humor to guide behavior without ever raising his voice. Whether it was teaching patience, setting boundaries, or simply managing chaos at family gatherings, he wielded subtlety like a skilled craftsman. Each action, each joke, each carefully timed response had a purpose: to maintain order, assert boundaries, and create memorable lessons without hostility. Over time, we began to notice that Grandpa's influence extended beyond our immediate family. Neighbors started respecting our boundaries without realizing why. Friends visiting for holidays seemed to unconsciously moderate their behavior, perhaps sensing that overstaying wasn't an option in our household. The story of the family who had been evicted by dogs became almost mythical in the neighborhood, shared quietly over fences, at bus stops, and in casual conversations. Grandpa's clever approach had ripple effects that extended far beyond our dining room. Even years later, when W.E. retold the story around family gatherings, it never failed to generate laughter. The combination of timing, calm demeanor, and unexpected chaos was timeless. Grandpa had shown us that enforcing boundaries didn't have to be confrontational. It could be clever, subtle, and hilariously effective. The memory of slobbery plates, wide-eyed guests, and Grandpa's serene composure continued to inspire awe and laughter, a lesson in life, social dynamics, and the art of getting your point across without anger or argument. The legend of Grandpa's ingenious, overstaying guest tactics only grew with time. By now, it wasn't just about the neighbors or distant cousins. It became a framework for how Grandpa managed any social situation where boundaries were being tested. He had mastered the art of turning frustration into comedy, and we, the grandchildren, became both his audience and his apprentices. One particularly memorable instance involved an old college friend of Grandma's who visited every month without fail, lingering for hours during tea time. Grandpa, ever watchful, had prepared long before the visit. That day, he strategically placed a small fan directly in front of her chair. At first, it was subtle, a gentle breeze. But as the conversation dragged on and she began recounting story after story from decades ago, the fan's angle shifted slightly, blowing papers, napkins, and even the edge of her scarf onto the floor. She tried to ignore it, but Grandpa, with the calmest expression imaginable, continued sipping his tea. Eventually, she had to stand up to adjust the papers, giving Grandpa the perfect opportunity to comment. "Oh, the dogs love when the papers hit the floor. They think it's playtime." Grandma nearly choked on her tea from laughter. The visitor, red-faced and bewildered, finally took the hint and left shortly thereafter. Just like that, another overstaying guest learned the unspoken rules of our household. Grandpa's tactics were always creative and adaptive. One evening, an old neighbor came by for a surprise visit during dinner. Grandpa had anticipated such a move and had already placed a tray of the messiest, stickiest dessert directly in the middle of the table. As the guest leaned in to serve herself, Grandpa calmly mentioned, "Watch the dogs. They love a sticky treat." Within seconds, our golden retriever bounded over and grabbed the dessert before anyone could react. The guest's eyes widened in horror, and Grandpa, ever composed, merely sipped his tea and said, "You see, timing is everything." These incidents taught the rest of us an invaluable lesson. Social finesse could be combined with humor to enforce boundaries. Grandpa never shouted, never embarrassed anyone unnecessarily, yet the message was always clear. Overstaying, overstepping, or taking advantage of someone's hospitality had consequences, but delivered in a way that was clever, memorable, and undeniably funny. Even family gatherings became arenas for Grandpa's subtle genius. On one occasion, a relative who had a habit of lingering after Sunday brunch found themselves trapped in an impromptu game designed by Grandpa. While everyone else cleaned up, he accidentally dropped a large pot of whipped cream near the edge of the table, creating an obstacle that required careful maneuvering. Each time the relative tried to return to their seat or reach for a snack, they'd bump into the mess, all while Grandpa acted completely innocent, watching with amusement as the lesson sank in without a single harsh word. The beauty of Grandpa's approach was that it was never mean-spirited. He understood human nature, and he knew that confrontation often led to defensiveness. Humor, on the other hand, disarmed people. It allowed him to make a point without creating resentment. The dogs, the minor accidents, and the carefully timed distractions weren't punishments. They were clever nudges that encouraged self-awareness and respect for others' boundaries. Grandma, meanwhile, loved to play along, often exaggerating her own reactions to heighten the effect. She would gasp, clutch her chest, and look horrified, as if the chaos were entirely unexpected. The combination of Grandpa's calm cunning and Grandma's theatrical reactions made the lessons unforgettable. Guests left not only with a clear understanding of their social limits, but also with stories they would likely tell for years about the house with the dogs, the clever grandfather, and the chaotic but humorous consequences of overstaying one's welcome. By now, the family next door had become almost mythical in our household lore. Every time someone new visited and lingered too long, Grandpa would casually mention, "You know, we once had a family who just wouldn't leave, and the dogs handled it." The phrase became a code, a subtle warning that boundaries mattered, and that in this house, cleverness and humor could achieve what direct confrontation could not. It wasn't just the guests who learned from Grandpa's methods. We, his grandchildren, absorbed lessons in patience, observation, and creative problem-solving. We realized that asserting boundaries didn't require anger. It required planning, timing, and sometimes the perfect blend of absurdity and subtlety. Watching him in action was like attending a masterclass in human behavior, with the added bonus of endless laughter. Even years later, whenever family members reminisced about overstaying guests or awkward social situations, Grandpa's tactics remained the gold standard. The dogs and plates incident, the fan strategy, and the whipped cream obstacle were all retold, slightly embellished with each recounting, but always retaining the central lesson. Boundaries are important, and cleverness can enforce them with humor and grace. By now, Grandpa's reputation as a master of handling overstaying guests had grown so much that even new visitors seemed to arrive with caution. It was as if the story of the neighbors, the dogs, and the slobbery plates had traveled through the grapevine faster than anyone could keep track of. Friends, relatives, and even casual acquaintances seemed to instinctively respect our household boundaries, perhaps sensing that crossing them could lead to unexpected, hilariously chaotic consequences. One afternoon, a couple of Grandma's friends came over unannounced, thinking they could drop in for tea and a chat. Grandpa, ever the strategist, had anticipated this. While they were settling in, he began discussing something intensely mundane: how to line up soup cans in the pantry in alphabetical order by brand. The friends nodded politely at first, but the monotony was brutal. Every pause, every detail, was painstakingly drawn out. You could see their enthusiasm drain as Grandpa's calm, deliberate explanations continued. By the end of the lesson, the friends were practically begging to leave, mumbling apologies as they hurried to get home. Grandpa smiled subtly, satisfied that the lesson had been delivered without ever saying a word directly. Then there was the time a distant relative lingered after dinner, claiming they wanted just a quick dessert. Grandpa had prepared for this eventuality as well. He casually brought out a large tray of chocolate-covered strawberries, perfectly arranged, except for one crucial detail. Each strawberry had been coated with a tiny dab of extra spicy chili powder under the chocolate. As the relative eagerly took the first bite, their eyes widened, and a cough erupted, sending everyone in the room into stifled laughter. Grandpa calmly sipped his tea, saying only, "Well, that's the risk you take when dessert takes too long." Lesson delivered, humor intact, and no one was hurt, except perhaps their pride. Even simple phone calls from friends who wanted to pop in were met with Grandpa's clever strategies. If someone called to announce an impromptu visit, he would respond casually, "Oh, wonderful. We were just about to start reorganizing the attic. Do come by." The implied activity was so tedious, so clearly time-consuming, that most visitors reconsidered and ended up rescheduling. Again, no confrontation, no rudeness, just subtle, effective boundary setting with a touch of humor. Grandma often marveled at Grandpa's creativity. She would watch him work, shaking her head in amazement. "I don't know how you do it," she'd whisper, "but somehow you make them leave without ever being mean." And that was the genius of it. It wasn't about anger or conflict. It was about observation, patience, and the perfect blend of timing and absurdity. Overstaying guests didn't stand a chance because Grandpa's strategies were as unpredictable as they were effective. Our younger cousins, observing all of this, learned valuable lessons about social cues, patience, and humor. We saw firsthand that enforcing boundaries could be both firm and funny, subtle yet unmistakable. Grandpa had transformed what could have been tense, frustrating encounters into memorable experiences filled with laughter and lessons. His methods taught us that creativity, strategy, and a calm demeanor were often more powerful than anger or confrontation. Even in casual neighborhood interactions, his tactics left a mark. People seemed to know instinctively that while Grandpa was kind, he was not to be taken lightly. Over time, the neighborhood adopted a kind of respectful distance. Guests arrived on time, stayed for reasonable durations, and often brought something to contribute to the meal, a subtle acknowledgement that our household had mastered the art of polite but firm social control. The story of the neighbors who had once shown up nightly continued to grow in legend. Each retelling added new layers: the dog's enthusiastic licking, Grandpa's serene expression, and the priceless looks on the family's faces. Even people who had never been present laughed at the mental image and appreciated the cleverness of it all. The story became more than just a family anecdote. It became a blueprint for handling awkward social situations with intelligence, humor, and dignity. And so, as the years passed, Grandpa's techniques became part of our family culture. Whether it was dogs, strategically placed fans, mild culinary pranks, or monotonous lectures about pantry organization, his approach remained consistent, subtle, humorous, and entirely effective. It was never about being mean. It was about creating boundaries in a way that no one could resist, and in the process, teaching all of us the power of wit, timing, and observation. By now, the entire household understood that overstaying one's welcome in our home wasn't just discouraged. It was gently, hilariously, and inevitably corrected. And through all of it, Grandpa remained calm, patient, and always a step ahead, ensuring that every lesson was learned, every boundary respected, and every story worth retelling. As the years went by, Grandpa's reputation for dealing with overstaying guests became nothing short of legendary, not just within our family, but among neighbors and friends who had heard the story. What had started as a simple, neighborly inconvenience evolved into a series of ingenious strategies, each more creative and hilariously effective than the last. Every visit, every knock at the door, became a potential stage for Grandpa's subtle genius. One memorable summer evening, the neighbors, yes, the same ones from the dogs and plates incident, decided to try their luck again. We hadn't seen them in months, and everyone assumed they had finally learned their lesson. But no, they strolled up to our door just as dinner was being served, expecting the usual hospitality. Grandpa, seated at the head of the table with that familiar twinkle in his eye, calmly set his fork down, leaned back, and said, "Ah, I was wondering when you'd show up again." What followed was a performance worthy of applause. Grandpa had prepared a small tray of spaghetti with extra sauce, so much sauce that it was borderline impossible to eat neatly. He set it on the table, sat back, and watched. The neighbors, blissfully unaware, attempted to serve themselves. Within minutes, strands of spaghetti were flung across the table, sauce dripped onto napkins, and a stray meatball rolled across the floor. Our dogs, of course, couldn't resist, darting in to clean up the mess with gleeful enthusiasm. The neighbors froze, horrified, while Grandpa sipped his tea and said, "You see, sometimes dinner entertains itself." By the time the neighbors realized what was happening, Grandpa had already planned his exit strategy. He subtly nudged Grandma, who pretended to cough and spill a little tea on the floor. As the guests scrambled to clean up the mess, Grandpa's expression remained serene, almost as if nothing were out of the ordinary. Eventually, they sheepishly apologized, mumbling something about just dropping in, and left without another word. Lesson reinforced, pride intact, and humor intact. The story of that evening became an instant classic in our family. Even years later, whenever someone mentioned overstaying guests, we'd recall the spaghetti incident with laughter. Grandpa's genius was in his calm demeanor, the ability to orchestrate chaos without raising his voice or making anyone feel attacked, while still making it impossible for guests to linger comfortably. But Grandpa didn't stop there. On another occasion, during a particularly rainy day, a distant cousin came over and overstayed during lunch. Grandpa, ever creative, decided to introduce a new method, the flood tactic. Without saying a word, he subtly placed a tray of water on the table edge while moving the dishes around, creating small splashes each time someone reached for food or utensils. The cousin, growing increasingly frustrated and drenched in tiny splashes, finally got the hint and quickly left. Grandma laughed so hard she had to sit down, while Grandpa simply smiled, satisfied that the lesson had been delivered without confrontation. The beauty of Grandpa's approach was that it relied entirely on observation, timing, and humor. He never shouted, never embarrassed anyone, yet the message was always clear. Boundaries mattered, overstaying was discouraged, and humor could be more effective than anger in teaching important lessons. The children learned from this. Subtlety, patience, and creativity often achieved better results than confrontation, and laughter could be a powerful tool in social dynamics. Even casual visitors began to respect the unwritten rules of our household. Friends and neighbors instinctively understood that lingering too long wasn't a good idea, without anyone having to explain it directly. Grandpa's stories, tactics, and quiet ingenuity had created a social code, a kind of invisible framework everyone seemed to follow naturally. And so, as the years went on, Grandpa's methods became part of family tradition. Each new visitor was met with subtle hints, playful obstacles, or clever diversions. We all knew the story of the neighbors, the dogs, the spaghetti, and the minor floods. But more importantly, we understood the lesson behind it. Hospitality was valuable, but so was respect for boundaries. Humor, observation, and patience were powerful tools for maintaining harmony without conflict. By the end of this period, the story of Grandpa's genius had reached legendary status. Not only had he successfully dealt with overstaying guests, but he had also taught all of us, his children, grandchildren, and extended family, an invaluable lesson in social dynamics, creativity, and subtle humor. The combination of calm authority, clever planning, and unexpected chaos had proven far more effective than confrontation or anger, and the log that followed cemented the lesson in everyone's mind. As the years rolled on, Grandpa's reputation as a master of handling overstaying guests only grew stronger. By now, it wasn't just our family who knew the story. It had spread to neighbors, friends, and even distant relatives. Whenever someone mentioned the problem of lingering visitors, someone would inevitably sigh and say, "Ah, you should have asked Grandpa. He'd handle it perfectly." And everyone would laugh, fully aware of the legendary exploits we had all witnessed firsthand. One particularly memorable summer evening brought the final, most iconic lesson. Our house had been hosting a family barbecue, complete with friends, neighbors, and a few distant cousins who hadn't yet learned the rules. The air was warm, the smell of grilling meat and spices filled the backyard, and everyone was in high spirits. Grandpa, ever the observer, noticed two particularly long-winded guests starting to dominate the conversation, monopolizing the drinks, and edging toward the buffet for a third helping. He calmly excused himself from his chair and walked inside. Moments later, he returned with a carefully assembled plan. He had placed a tray of mini pies on the edge of the table, each topped with a generous dollop of whipped cream, strategically balanced to tip over at the slightest touch. At the same time, he had directed the dogs to wait nearby, anticipating the chaos that would soon unfold. The first guest reached for a pie. Immediately, it wobbled precariously and fell, smearing whipped cream onto the edge of the table, and a little on the guest's hand. The dog leapt into action, licking the dessert with unrestrained enthusiasm, while the other guest jumped back, horrified. Grandpa, calm and composed, sipped his lemonade as if nothing unusual had happened. "Well," he said in his signature serene tone, "the dogs appreciate a little dessert too." The guests, now completely stunned, quickly realized that overstaying was no longer an option and quietly retreated, muttering Apollo geese under their breath. The brilliance of Grandpa's approach was never in aggression or confrontation. It was in observation, timing, and humor. He didn't need to raise his voice, scold anyone, or make them feel unwelcome. Instead, he created situations that were subtly uncomfortable, often hilarious, and impossible to ignore. The guests left knowing they had overstepped, yet unable to hold a grudge, because the chaos had been so absurdly clever. Even Grandma, who had often laughed the hardest, marveled at his ingenuity. "I don't know how you do it," she said, shaking her head. "You've turned setting boundaries into an art form." And that was the truth. Grandpa had mastered the delicate balance of teaching lessons without hostility, of enforcing rules with humor, and of turning what could have been tense, awkward encounters into unforgettable experiences filled with laughter and insight. The story of the neighbors, the spaghetti incident, the minor flood, and now the mini pies became the cornerstone of our family lore. Every gathering, every meal, every casual conversation could circle back to the genius of Grandpa's methods. We learned that boundaries could be set firmly yet humorously, that clever planning could prevent conflict, and that observation and timing often spoke louder than words ever could. By the time I was an adult, I found myself applying Grandpa's methods in my own life. Subtle hints, humor, and clever planning became tools for handling awkward social situations, for teaching lessons without conflict, and for protecting boundaries in a way that was memorable, effective, and often funny. Grandpa had taught more than just how to handle overstaying guests. He had taught the art of social finesse, patience, and the power of creativity. And though the neighbors never returned for dinner after that first infamous night, their presence, and the lessons learned from their audacity, remained a constant reminder of Grandpa's brilliance. Every plate, every dog, every subtle act of chaos was a testament to his quiet genius. The story ended not with anger, frustration, or confrontation, but with laughter, respect, and a lesson that lasted far beyond that dinner table. In the end, Grandpa showed us all that sometimes the best way to handle overstaying guests is not to yell, not to scold, and not to be confrontational, but to think creatively, act subtly, and let humor do the work. And as we sat around the table, retelling his stories, laughing until our sides hurt, we knew that no matter how bold or persistent the guests, Grandpa had already won the battle, quietly, cleverly, and hilariously.